The Spanish Civil War was a struggle of polar political ideologies. Between 1936 and 1939, some 1,500 Canadians left for Spain to oppose the fascist rebellion led by General Francisco Franco. 600 of them never returned. Reasons for voluntary participation varied. Some of them had been politically radicalized by the deprivations caused by the Great Depression, and they were attracted to Spain for ideological reasons. Or some yearned for a sense of meaning and adventure in their lives. Others were motivated simply by a feeling of kinship with the victims of fascism. Most would have considered themselves as politically socialist or liberal, but some were politically conservative and became involved because they recognized potential dangers in the rise of fascism as well. Half of the volunteers were veterans of the work camps, and many were involved in the On to Ottawa trek. Despite the eclectic mix of motives, the Canadian government met all of them with hostility. The volunteers were treated as radicals and traitors, not as far-sighted idealists. In an attempt to contain the burgeoning volunteer movement, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King implemented the Foreign Enlistment Act. This act stated that anyone who enlisted in an illegal war would be subject to a large fine or imprisonment. While Canada and other Western nations turned their backs on Spain, international brigades were formed in 53 countries to support what they believed was the cause of democracy. What resulted was an international war that divided loyalties across the political spectrum. The fact that the Republican government consisted of a coalition of left-leaning parties, including communists, and that the USSR was so prompt in its support undoubtedly created the largest single cause for the lack of support from Western democracies. The Western democracies claimed they remained non-interventionist because they wished to avoid a full-scale war. However, it became evident that they were more troubled with communism than they were fascism. Canadian volunteers became caught up in this ideological struggle. Whatever their personal motives, they came to be branded as instruments of unpopular leftist organizations both at home and abroad. In 1998, the provincial government of British Columbia provided a site near the legislative grounds in Victoria for a monument to the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion. The unveiling and dedication of the plaque took place on December 4, 1998. There were short speeches by Premier Glenn Clark and several Mackenzie Papineau veterans, followed by an unveiling at the site at Confederation Plaza. Nearly 60 years after the veterans returned home, they were finally recognized. Yet it was not an easy struggle. For the Canadian veterans who fought in Spain with great resolve and idealism, they had been given little recognition until this monument was erected. With the Cold War now over, the Western democracies and governments finally felt more secure in acknowledging those veterans who were willing to fight against fascism under the banner of various liberal and left-wing organizations. So why were so many Canadians driven to support a cause so far away and with no obvious or direct connection to Canada? In order to understand why Canadians were inspired to fight for Spanish democracy, we must first look at conditions in Spain which led up to the Civil War. In 1931, King Alfonso of Spain abdicated the throne. A democratic government was then formed following a popular election. Spain at this time was still a desperately poor country, but the government proceeded with drastic social reforms nonetheless. The new government built over 9,000 schools in the first 2 years and redistributed over 12 million acres to the landless peasants. However, the landowners, the military, and the all-powerful Spanish Catholic Church stubbornly resisted change. The Popular Front government was made up of dozens of splinter factions and political parties. In their re-election in 1936, an attempt to further consolidate the power of the Front government was organized by the Communists. While the government squabbled over political organization, Franco and his officers in Spanish Morocco rose in open revolt against the newly formed Republican government. With the help of Hitler and Mussolini, Franco had his highly trained African troops sent to the Spanish mainland, supported by landowners, the Catholic clergy, and the emerging fascist organizations from within Spain and without. Franco claimed loyalty to Spain over loyalty to the government and used this nationalist stance as a wedge against all things foreign, particularly left-wing ideology. The government's internal troubles forced them to look abroad for help. The bleak conditions at home for many Canadians and the keen awareness of the threat of fascism and a sense of adventure would draw them to the shores of Spain. For those Canadians who lost their jobs and remained out of work through much of the 1930s, there seemed little hope for a better future. Savings had been wiped out by currency depreciation, and in many countries, including Canada, unemployment insurance and public welfare programs had yet to be instituted. While Franklin Delano Roosevelt offered Americans a New Deal, the Bennett government in Canada offered relief camps. The camps were little more than prisons, where, in exchange for an allowance of 20 cents a day and a hardboard bed in a tar paper shack, the internees built roads with picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. The camps were run by the Ministry of National Defense, and by 1935 there were some 200 camps in British Columbia, with some holding as many as 2,000 occupants. There were other camps all through Canada, but the highest concentration of them were in British Columbia. Although the federal government liked to say that entry into the camps was voluntary, failure to volunteer for the camps could result in a denial of relief benefits. The only other option for many would be to hit the road and look for work from town to town, but neither did this option provide any security for working-class Canadians. The Bennett government's inability to deal with the Depression only further alienated the working classes from the Canadian government. Inevitably, the radical left in Canada discovered in the inhabitants of these relief camps what it deemed flagrant examples of the abuses of capitalism and a reactionary government. A comfortable alliance began between struggling Canadians and left-wing ideology. On April 4, 1935, about 3,000 workers in British Columbia walked out of their camps and hitchhiked to Vancouver, where, for 2 months, they rallied for improved conditions. After receiving little to no response from provincial and federal governments, they decided to travel to Ottawa to proclaim their position. The legendary On to Ottawa trek was on, but it was halted in Regina while the leaders of the strike headed for Ottawa to meet with the Prime Minister. The meeting was a complete failure with Bennett, and the trekkers in Regina were treated as rioters and were violently dispersed by the RCMP. 2 years later, when the Communists began to seek out volunteers to Spain, they found the largest single response among the veterans of the relief camps and the On to Ottawa trek. In supporting the cause of the Spanish conflict, many Canadians may have felt they were getting back at their own government, which had done so little for them in the first half of the decade. Canadians who were veterans of the On to Ottawa trek and the relief camps comprised 1/2 of the recruits of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion. The majority of volunteers from Canada were working class. The Canadian contingent represented a militant proletariat. It could not be said to have reflected any sort of cross-section of the Canadian populace, unlike the American group, which included workers, teachers, actors, and lawyers. Canadian volunteers were longshoremen, miners, fishermen, mechanics, steel workers, lumberjacks, and machinists. This distinction may have been due to the reliance of the communists on the quasi-organization which grew out of the earliest protest movements. The motives of the Canadian volunteers were shaped largely by the political and socio-economic realities, and less so by romantic adventure. The Communist Party of Canada played a very important role in the mobilization of Canadians in the cause for Spain. Tim Buck, the General Secretary of the party, was a vocal proponent of Canadian volunteerism. Much of the Canadian government's refusal to recognize the volunteers was undoubtedly based on the role that the Communist Party played in the mobilization effort. However, it would be inaccurate to assume that all Canadians wanted to fly under the banner of world socialism. A popular front-type movement developed in Canada that included a variety of ethnic, cultural, and political elements that had one thing in common regardless of political persuasion or cultural background. That was a unanimous decision to stamp out fascism. Even those who simply sought adventure recognized fascism as a potent threat to the ideals of democracy. Regardless of political conviction, many recognized the contributions of the Canadian Communist Party and were willing to work with them even if they did not subscribe to socialism. While some were inspired and motivated by the Communist Party of Canada, others found inspiration in the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or CCF, while others yet found inspiration in the Liberal Party. Some had no political motivations other than their disdain of fascism. In a letter written to the editor of Saturday Night in February of 1939, A.D. Schatz stated this: "My brother, who fought 18 months in the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion of the International Brigade, was not, nor is he, a communist. His political affiliations were with the Liberal Party. A friend of mine from Montreal, S.H. Abrahamson, also a volunteer, was, prior to enlistment, active in an official capacity in a Zionist youth organization, which is admittedly anti-communist. Bill Jordan from West York was a Tory stalwart." Tim Buck recognized the diversity of those who volunteered, but he also acknowledged the large role that the Communist Party played in the mobilization process, not only in Canada, but in most of the international brigades. He stated this: "The International Brigades was made up of people who were not necessarily party members, but almost anybody who came from abroad. As a matter of fact, the International Brigade came to include people who had never been near the Communist Party. But because of its origins and the role the Communist parties of different countries played in forming it, I think it is necessary to acknowledge that by and large the driving force and the organization was by communists in it." The most prominent Canadian associated with the Spanish Civil War was Norman Bethune, who organized a mobile blood transfusion unit to serve the Loyalist forces on the front lines. Bethune was born in Gravenhurst, Ontario in 1890. On finishing high school, he went to the University of Toronto to study medicine, receiving his MD in 1916. In 1921, he started a career in thoracic surgery at the Toronto General Hospital. In 1928, he moved on to the thoracic unit of the Royal Victoria Hospital, the teaching hospital associated with McGill University in Montreal. Bethune was always concerned about social issues. He took a year off from university to teach immigrant mine workers in Northern Ontario how to read and write. He volunteered as a stretcher bearer in 1914 when World War I broke out and was wounded in France. In Montreal, he campaigned for socialized medicine, seeking out the poor and giving them free medical care. In 1935, he traveled to the Soviet Union to observe firsthand their system of health care. That same year, he joined the Communist Party of Canada. With the outbreak of the Civil War in Spain, he became involved with the Committee to Aid Spanish Democracy. It was this organization that supported his going to Spain in 1936 to offer his medical help to the cause. Initially, he planned to offer his services as surgeon, but on assessing the situation there more carefully, he decided that a mobile blood transfusion unit would be of greater use. The CASD, the Committee to Aid Spanish Democracy, would finance the acquisition of the needed equipment. The unit would set up its headquarters in Madrid, where blood donations would be received from the local residents and then transported to the wounded at the front. Instead of taking the wounded to the blood, he took the blood to the wounded. The more rapidly a wounded soldier could be operated on, the more likely he would survive. This was the essence of the blood transfusion unit, its mobility. The establishment of the unit was an incontestably positive contribution to military medicine that would serve as a model for blood transfusion services in the Second World War. After a year in Spain, Bethune returned to Canada to launch a speaking tour aimed at arousing understanding and support for the Loyalist cause. Whatever the motives of individuals within the various battalions in Spain, their direct or indirect affiliation with communist parties would only serve to stigmatize them and create difficulties for them from their respective governments. The role of the Soviet Union in the formation of the international brigades was also used in the propaganda campaign against the Republican government. They were the first and only European power to support Spain's government with equipment and military supplies. The intervention of the USSR was used as an excuse not to provide aid to the elected government, and later to discredit the survivors of the international forces when they returned from Spain. To anti-fascists, the USSR seemed to be the only bastion against Hitler. In the mid-30s, the USSR was still viewed as a sort of working-class paradise amongst many leftist organizations. However, the realities of Stalin's purges and terror campaigns were not yet common knowledge, and many working-class citizens viewed the USSR as a source of ideological and moral leadership. Yet the one common denominator between the Western democracies and the fascist states was their contempt for and fear of communism in all its shapes and forms. The mainstream media's portrayal of the Spanish Civil War was predictably negative. While the American Hearst newspaper chain persisted in describing members of the Popular Front as Catholic church burners, killers of priests, rapers of nuns, and looters of small businesses, it was evident that few people were duped by these reports. The stories appearing in such Canadian publications as Maclean's and Le Devoir were equally laden with distortion. There was very little middle ground in the press in Canada. The deeply divided 30s greatly reflected itself in the newspapers and periodicals of the day. Progressive papers like the Winnipeg Free Press, the Toronto Star, the Vancouver Province generally supported the Loyalists, while Maclean's and the Globe and Mail generally did not. The official position of the Mackenzie King government was equally negative and generally reflected the more conservative mainstream within Canadian society. King resented the communist influence within the international brigades and the Republican government itself. He fully sympathized with governments, like that of Germany, which resorted to stamping out communism by legalized repression. In 1937, King would travel to Europe. The highlight of his trip was his visit with Hitler and a tour through Berlin and many parts of Germany's industrial sector. His visit to Berlin came 2 years after the implementation of the Nuremberg Laws, and the treatment of the Jews at that time was blatantly clear. Jewish businesses were closed down, and signs all over Berlin banished Jews. It was obvious what was going on. However, in his diary after his trip, King wrote these words: "Looking back over the German visit, I can honestly say that it was as enjoyable and inspiring as any visit I have had anywhere. The German people seem much easier to understand and more like ourselves than either the French or the English." As King spoke admiringly of German progress, bombs were dropping on Canadian volunteers in Spain. The Luftwaffe was testing out their new Blitzkrieg campaign while King fraternized with Adolf Hitler. Within weeks of his trip to Germany, one of King's top priorities was to recommend vigorous application of the Foreign Enlistment Act. This made it illegal for Canadians to serve in any foreign military service. The same policies were implemented in the United States, Britain, and France. A pattern seemed clear not only within the King government, but all the Western democracies in terms of their views of Republican Spain. At the League of Nations, the Spanish Republic representative pleaded for aid from the West, but instead, France and Britain concocted non-intervention pacts with both Germany and Italy. France closed its border to Spain. Britain enforced a blockade which prevented even medical supplies and food from passing into Republican hands. And Canada implemented policies to make it illegal for Canadians to volunteer. After the government moved to restrict passports on August 10, 1937, Canadian volunteers left with passports stamped, quote, "not valid for Spain," end quote. By that time, 500 volunteers were already in Spain, and the 700 who went after the application of the Act ceased to exist in the eyes of the Canadian government. Despite Canada's official non-interventionist stance, supplies shipped from Canada were reaching Franco's fascist forces through Morocco. At the same time, Canadians were officially forbidden to fight on behalf of the Loyalist government. The Canadian volunteers were not only dealing with adversity on the battlefield, but also on the home front. Yet despite all these roadblocks, Canadians continue to go to Spain, even if they were committing a criminal act. Many traveled to France and listed the Paris Exposition as their destination. Certainly, Canadian immigration must have begun to wonder why so many young, single, working-class males were going to Paris with only the clothes on their back and very little cash in their wallets. The governments of the Western democracies had waged a consistent and successful campaign throughout the Civil War to deny aid and assistance to the legitimate Republican government of Spain. In effect, not only did the Canadian government attempt to prevent Canadian volunteerism by legal means, they did all they could to avoid assistance to Spain, helping to make the war conditions for all volunteers intolerable. The Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion and other Canadians were fighting a war what they felt was of honor and principle. Their own government saw them as subversives and radicals who needed to be contained and ostracized. As the Canadians started to leave Spain in late 1938, the Spanish people organized elaborate parades and rallies honoring the courage of the international brigades. Vast crowds lined the streets of Barcelona, and flowers were thrown on the pavement in front of the marching soldiers. But their brave attempts to stop fascism could not repel the powerful military machines of Germany, Italy, and Franco's highly trained Moroccan troops. The Canadian troops had to rely on volunteer organizations in Canada to get them home. The Friends of the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion had now put all their resources into getting them there. This placed the Canadian government in a very awkward situation. They could see that many Canadians were supportive of the volunteers, and to sit by would only make them look bad. Other groups were also struggling to get the men back. The Communist Party of Canada mortgaged some of the buildings it owned and undertook its own campaign to raise funds. The British and Americans had already departed the country, and this fact, coupled with the strain of waiting and the emotional letdown after months of combat, cast many of the Canadians into a black depression. As the government of Canada bumbled, the troops sat in camps on the borders of Spain, waiting to find a way back to Canada. An almost comic tragic circumstance had developed in this folly. Half of the troops, who were veterans of the relief camps in BC, went to Spain to do something honorable and brave. When they finished their military venture and were ready to come home, they waited in camps, where conditions were even worse than that of the relief camps. For some, it must have seemed a cruel joke. Getting the troops home proved to be a very difficult task. The Spanish government was bankrupt as a result of the war, and efforts outside of Spain needed to be found to get the Canadians back home. The CPR was prepared to transport them back to Canada, but required $10,000 in fares. A wealthy Canadian named Garfield Weston ended up putting in $5,000. After a tense waiting period, the troops were finally brought home, but it was not until non-government organizations could acquire the funds to do it. Some volunteers ended up in camps in France, while others of foreign origin returned to their home countries in Europe. Despite the Canadian government's ambivalence, large cheering crowds met the returning veterans in all the major cities of Canada. The troops had their faith revived when Canadian citizens treated them like heroes. It no longer mattered that the government remained so indifferent to their plight. The newspapers of the day were filled with stories such as the following account in Saturday Night, entitled "The Soldier's Return." It is impossible not to feel a great deal of sympathy for the members of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, who have this week returned to Canada after a long and not inglorious campaign on the government side in Spain. Whatever their religious and economic belief, they went gladly and without any necessity into great danger for the sake of what they believed to be the best interests of humanity and justice. They may or may not have been in error, but the assumption that they, and all others who fought on the same side as Soviet Russia, are seeking the destruction of the human race is too much for our own credulity. A considerable number of them held no communist theories and did not regard themselves as fighting for the triumph of the communist system. We question the good taste and even wit of the Montrealers who greeted them with a fascist salute. Though men who have fought for a cause, however unsuccessful, are not likely to be much disturbed by gestures of those who never fought for anything. The Canadians who fought in Spain argued that if fascism was not contained there would result another global conflict. Just months after they left Spain, their predictions came true. But the signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact in August of 1939 was a nasty blow to their cause. Many Spanish veterans were interned after the war because the Canadian government considered them dangerous. Many sought to volunteer for the Canadian Army to once again fight fascism, but they were declined. This unwarranted suspension of their civil liberties was indeed a bitter pill to swallow, for the veterans who were arrested had already risked their lives in the fight against fascism. Not until well after Germany invaded the USSR were the Spanish veterans allowed to enlist. Although they were forgiven temporarily during the latter part of the Second World War, the subsequent Cold War put them once again in the spotlight as subversives. With each swing of the ideological pendulum, the veterans of Spain were judged by the perspectives of the day. When the veterans of the International Brigades, Mackenzie Papineau Battalion of Canada, petitioned the Canadian government in the 1980s to have the surviving volunteers recognized as veterans of Canada's wars, the request was denied. In December of 1998, with the bestowing of the monument in Victoria, BC, recognition had finally come. It took 60 years to recognize these veterans, but not everyone has been supportive. The BC branch of the Royal Canadian Legion disapproves of the Victoria Monument. That particular group was involved in an illegal operation as far as the participation in the Spanish Civil War goes, stated then Provincial Legion President Brian Caldwells. Yet regardless of the few malcontents, there's little question that these brave Canadians did the right thing. The Spanish Civil War was a conflict that does not look well upon the Western democracies in hindsight. Perhaps as we forgive the West for their misjudgment, we can acknowledge those Canadians who fought willingly to defend democracy and oppose fascism. With the Cold War well behind us now, we can pay our respects to these brave Canadians without it being perceived through the lens of the Cold War.